The words were a blade not hot with anger, but cold with the chilling finality of a verdict. "You're not family anymore." She said it. My daughter, my Nancy, the child, whose very first breath seemed to have been taken only moments ago. She said it in the living room. I had painted a soft buttercup yellow to welcome her home from the hospital, and her husband, my son-in-law Tyler, stood beside her, his arms crossed in a posture of smug agreement. They had just told me they were selling the house I had given them, the house I still lived in, and when I had protested, crying, that they couldn't just cast me aside, they had delivered that final soul-crushing blow. They thought that because I had signed a piece of paper, they had signed away my personhood. They thought my grief for my late husband Frank had hollowed me out and left me a compliant shell. They didn't know that inside that shell, a quiet, furious pearl was forming. They had made me a guest in my own home, and then a tenant, and finally a stranger. They were about to learn that even strangers have rights, especially when one of them still knows a very good lawyer. The story of how I lost my home began, ironically, with me trying to save it from silence. When Frank passed, the big house in Cincinnati, the one we had poured 40 years of our lives and savings into, became an echo chamber of my grief. The silence was a physical weight, a constant companion that sat with me at the dinner table and lay beside me in our empty bed. I was withering from loneliness. Nancy and Tyler were living in a cramped apartment downtown, perpetually complaining about the rent, the noise, and the impossibility of getting ahead. They were my only family, and my heart ached for their struggles and for my own solitude. My idea, born from a mother's desperate need to nurture, seemed like a perfect solution. I would give them the house, not just let them move in, but give it to them outright. It was a grand, foolish, and loving gesture. I saw it as a way to secure their future, to give them the foundation Frank and I had worked so hard to build, and in return, I would have the sound of life, of family, in these quiet halls again. I remember the day I told them my plan. We were sitting on the back porch, the air thick with the scent of my climbing roses. "I want to give you the house," I'd said, my voice trembling with the magnitude of my own generosity. "I want you to have it. I'll sign it over to you. My only condition is that I can live here, in my own room, for the rest of my days." They were stunned into silence, but only for a moment. Then came the performance. Nancy's eyes filled with what I mistook for tears of gratitude. "Oh, Mom," she'd whispered, "we can't let you do that. It's your home." Tyler had played his part with Oscar-worthy sincerity, shaking his head. "Margaret, that's too much. We could never accept." But they did accept. Of course they did. I hired a lawyer, a man they recommended, to draw up the paper. He explained it as a form of estate planning, a way to avoid probate and taxes down the line. It all sounded so practical, so responsible. I signed the deed, my hand shaking, my heart swelling with a sense of maternal sacrifice and love. I was giving my daughter the world, or at least my small brick-and-mortar corner of it. I had just signed my own eviction notice. I had handed them the keys to my kingdom, and the sword to cut me out of it, and they had taken both with smiling, grateful faces. I thought I was securing my place within the family. I didn't realize I was signing my own exile. The first year of our new arrangement was a masterclass in gradual erasure. They moved in, and at first, the noise and activity were a welcome balm to my lonely soul. But slowly, insidiously, my home began to feel less and less like my own. It started with the small things, the subtle dismissals of my taste and my history. The floral curtains my mother had sewn, which had hung in the dining room for 30 years, were the first to go. "They're just so dated, Mom," Nancy had said, her voice laced with a gentle pity that was more insulting than outright criticism. They were replaced with stark, gray panels that made the room feel like a hotel lobby. Frank's favorite worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint imprint of his body, was moved to the basement and replaced with a cold, angular sofa that was impossible to get comfortable on. "We're just trying to create a more modern, cohesive look," Tyler would explain, as if my life, My memories were an aesthetic to be curated and improved upon. My collection of family photos on the mantelpiece, Nancy's baby pictures, our wedding portrait, a faded photo of my own parents, were gradually taken down. We're just decluttering, Nancy would say, replacing them with a single large, abstract painting that looked like a blue smudge. It creates a more sophisticated focal point. Every change was a quiet act of violence, a negation of the life Frank and I had built. I would walk through the rooms of my own home and feel like a visitor, a ghost from a previous administration. The kitchen, once my undisputed domain, became another front in their quiet war. My recipes, the ones Nancy had begged for as a child, were now met with polite disgust. My Sunday meatloaf was too heavy. My habit of making a pot of grits for breakfast was met with lectures on carbohydrates and glycemic indexes. They filled my refrigerator with strange green juices and foods I couldn't pronounce, their clean eating a constant, implicit criticism of the way I had nourished them their entire lives. The injustice of it all began as a slow, burning fire in my chest. I tried to voice my feelings, to hold my ground on small things. Tyler, that coffee table was a gift from your grandparents, I'd say. I know, Mom. And it was great, he'd reply, his tone making it clear it was no longer great. But it just doesn't work with the new aesthetic. We have to think about the overall flow of the house. The house, not my house, the house. The language had shifted, and with it, the balance of power. Every preference I expressed was treated as a stubborn refusal to get with the time. I was being made to feel like the difficult one, the one who was preventing our new family from gelling. I was being gaslit in my own living room, made to feel unreasonable for wanting to see my own life reflected in the home I had given them. I found myself spending more and more time in my bedroom, the last bastion of my former life. I would sit on the edge of my bed and listen to the sounds of my world being systematically dismantled. I told myself this was the compromise required for family, for not being alone. But the loneliness I felt then, surrounded by people who were actively erasing me, was 1,000 times more profound and painful than the quiet solitude I had known before. The subtle conquest of my home was just the beginning. Once they had established their aesthetic dominance, they turned their attention to my finances. The maneuver was executed with the same chilling precision, all under the guise of loving, familial concern. They sat me down one evening, their faces arranged into masks of deep sincerity. "Mom," Tyler began, his voice low and serious, "we were looking over your bills, and honestly, it seems like a lot for you to manage. We're worried about you," Nancy chimed in, her voice a soft, persuasive murmur. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Margaret. What if you missed a payment? We think it would be so much easier if we helped you organize everything. We could set up a joint account for all the household expenses." A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Frank had been a meticulous planner. He had left me financially secure, independent. My savings, my pension, they were my last vestige of autonomy. To cede control of that felt like the final, irreversible surrender. "I'm perfectly capable of paying my own bills," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Of course you are, Mom," Tyler soothed, his tone so placating, it felt like a pat on the head of a difficult child. "No one is questioning your ability. This is about family helping family. It's about us taking some of the burden off your shoulder." They were so skilled at it, twisting my competence into a vulnerability they needed to protect. They framed their power grab as an act of loving care. To refuse would be to seem paranoid, to shatter the fragile illusion of the happy family I so desperately wanted to believe in. And so, worn down by grief and a desperate desire for peace, I agreed. The trip to the bank was a surreal experience. Tyler, his hand firmly on my elbow, did all the talking. Charmed the bank manager with a beautifully crafted story about setting up a consolidated family estate account to make things easier for his beloved mother. I signed the documents where he told me to, my signature on the page, feeling like a betrayal of everything Frank and I had built. The moment I did, the floodgates of my life savings were thrown open. For the first few weeks, They maintained the illusion of responsibility. The utility bills were paid, but then the bank statements, which they started trying to hide from me, began to tell a different story. There were charges from high-end restaurants in downtown Cincinnati. There were online shopping sprees for designer clothes. There was a weekend getaway to Chicago that I only learned about through a photo Nancy posted on social media. I found a statement they had carelessly left on the kitchen counter and confronted Tyler, my hand shaking as I pointed to a charge for several $1,000s from an electronics store. A massive, wall-sized television now dominated the living room. "What is this, Tyler?" I asked. "It's an upgrade, Mom," he said, not even looking away from the screen. "An investment in the property. It increases the resale value." The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. My life savings, the money Frank and I had scrimped and saved for our old age, was being used to invest in a house they now owned, and I was being told it was for my benefit. I was no longer a mother. I was the silent, involuntary backer of their increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The injustice of it was a constant, dull ache in my chest. I had given them my home, my trust, and now, my financial security. I was funding my own marginalization, paying for the very chains that were binding me, and they had the audacity to call it family. With my home redecorated to their tastes, and my finances under their control, Nancy began the final phase of her campaign, my complete and utter isolation. She seemed to operate with the cold, calculating precision of a general, identifying and neutralizing every potential source of outside support I had. My friends, the women who had been my lifeline since Frank's death, were the first to be cut off. My weekly bridge game with my best friend, Monica, and two other ladies was a sacred ritual. It was a few hours of laughter, shared stories, and a blessed respite from the escalating tension in my own home. "Mom," Nancy announced one Tuesday, her tone bright and non-negotiable, "Tyler and I have decided to start hosting a weekly dinner party for some of his work contacts. We'll be using the dining room on Wednesday nights, so you'll have to find another time for your little card game." I was floored. "But Nancy, we've played on Wednesdays for almost 20 years, I protested weakly. "Well, times change," she replied with a dismissive shrug. "This is important for Tyler's career." It was a lie, of course. The dinner party happened exactly once, but its purpose was served. My bridge game, my small circle of joy, was effectively disbanded. I was forced to make a series of humiliating phone calls to my friends, offering flimsy excuses that I knew they didn't believe. Monica, my dearest and most stubborn friend, was not so easily dissuaded. She knew something was deeply wrong. She kept calling, trying to make plans, but Nancy always had a new, more elaborate excuse ready. I would listen from my bedroom, a helpless prisoner, as Nancy's voice, a masterpiece of feigned concern, wove a tapestry of my supposed decline. "Oh, Monica, I'm so sorry Margaret is just not up to having visitors today. She's been so frail and tired," or even more cruelly, "her memory has been a little off lately. The doctor says it's best to keep her environment calm and not to overstimulate her." It was a diabolically brilliant strategy. She was not only cutting me off from my support system, but also actively constructing a narrative of my incompetence. She was discrediting me in advance, ensuring that if I ever did manage to cry for help, I would be dismissed as a confused, senile old woman. The world outside my front door became a distant, unattainable land. They had sold my car, claiming it was unsafe for me to drive, leaving me completely dependent on them for transportation, a service they rarely, if ever, provided. A trip to the Target for my own toiletries became a complex negotiation that usually ended with, "We'll try to get to it this weekend, Margaret." My world shrank until it was contained within the four walls of the house, and within those walls, I was an inmate. The loneliness was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, stabbing pain. It was the excruciating loneliness of being erased, while still breathing. They no longer bothered with the pretense of including me in their lives. They would talk over me, around me, about me, as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to be breathing. Their cruelty became casual, a part of the daily routine. Tyler would helpfully explain the plot of a television show to me as if I were a child. Nancy would organize my bookshelf, donating books she deemed too old-fashioned. I was being infantilized and erased, my identity worn away by the constant, daily friction of their disrespect. I was a ghost in my own home, haunting the memories of a life they were systematically bulldozing to make way for their own opulent, empty future. Once the deed was in their name, and my finances were under their control, the final vestiges of their respect for me evaporated. I was no longer a mother to be placated. I was a tenant to be managed, and a particularly inconvenient one at that. The first major change was my physical relocation. The master bedroom, the room I had shared with Frank for 4 decades, the room that held the ghosts of our entire marriage, was suddenly needed for a home office. Tyler's going to be working from home more, Nancy announced one morning, not even looking at me as she measured the wall. He needs a dedicated space with good light. We're going to move you into the guest room. The guest room was a small dark space at the back of the house, a room that had always been used for storage. It had a single high window that looked out onto the neighbor's brick wall. It was a clear and brutal demotion. But this is my room, I protested, my voice trembling. Your father and I. Mom, please, Tyler interrupted, his tone laced with a weary impatience that had become his default setting when speaking to me. It's just a room. You'll be more comfortable in the guest room. It's cozier, that's what they called it. My world was being systematically shrunk, and they were calling it a favor. They moved my things that weekend, packing my life into cardboard boxes with a chilling efficiency. I watched as they dismantled my sanctuary, my last remaining foothold in the home that was once mine. The pretense of me being a part of their family was well and truly over. I was now living under their roof, by their rules. My presence at mealtimes became a source of tension. I would sit at the dining table they had bought with my money, and they would carry on conversations that pointedly excluded me. They would discuss their friends, their vacation plans, their future, all while I sat in silence, a ghost, at the feast. Soon, even that became too much for them. One evening, Nancy suggested, with a bright, false smile, that perhaps I would be more comfortable eating my meals in my room. It's just that Tyler and I have so much work to discuss, she'd said. We don't want to bore you with all the shop talk. The message was clear. My presence was an intrusion on their life. I began to eat my meals alone, in my small dark room, listening to the sounds of their laughter, drifting down the hallway. The isolation was a physical ache, a constant companion. It was during this period of intense misery that I began to overhear snippets of their real plans for me. They no longer bothered to lower their voices. So secure were they in their belief that I was a deaf, defeated old woman. I found a place online, I heard Nancy say to Tyler one night, her voice a low murmur from the living room. It's called Golden Meadows. It looks clean, and it's affordable. My blood ran cold. Golden Meadows, it sounded like a name for a cemetery, not a place for the living. It was a nursing home. They were researching places to put me. We just need to talk to the lawyer again, Tyler replied. See what the process is for getting her placed. He said, if we can get a doctor to sign off on her confusion, it should be straightforward. Confusion. They were not just content to have my house and my money. They were actively plotting to have me declared mentally incompetent, to strip me of my last shred of legal autonomy, so they could dispose of me without any further trouble. The full monstrous scope of their betrayal was finally laid bare. This was not about them needing a place to stay. This was a long, calculated con. They had moved in with the intention of taking everything: my home, my money, my freedom, and finally, my very personhood. The love I had for my daughter, already a bruised and battered thing, shriveled into a cold, hard knot of pure survival. They had misjudged me. They saw an old, grieving widow. They didn't see the woman who had survived poverty, who had nursed a dying husband, who had raised a child on her own strength. They didn't know that beneath the soft, quiet exterior was a spine of steel, and it was beginning to stiffen. The first shot in our counteroffensive was a formal, chillingly polite letter from Jessica's office, delivered by courier to the house that was no longer mine. It summoned Tyler and Nancy to a mandatory settlement conference, using ambiguous legal phrasing about clarifying certain outstanding matters regarding the estate and your mother's ongoing welfare. Jessica predicted correctly that their arrogance would lead them to believe the meeting was about finalizing my admission into the nursing home they had chosen. They would walk into the lion's den believing they were the hunters. The day of the meeting, I dressed with deliberate care. I wore a charcoal gray suit that had belonged to me from my working days at the bank, a style that was classic and commanding. Monica helped me style my hair, and for the first time in over a year I wore a touch of lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see the frightened, downtrodden woman who had fled her home in the rain. I saw Margaret Davis, a woman of substance and resolve. I saw a survivor. I sat beside Jessica at the large conference table, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in front of me. When Tyler and Nancy arrived, their expressions were a mixture of impatience and smug confidence. Tyler gave me a cursory nod, avoiding my eyes. Nancy offered a tight, false smile. "We hope this won't take long, Jessica," Tyler said, taking a seat opposite us. "We have a very busy schedule." Jessica smiled a thin, humorless smile. "I assure you, Mr. Davis, you will want to clear your schedule," she began without preamble, her voice calm and lethal. "We are here today to discuss the fraudulent transfer of property located at 123 Maple Street, the systematic financial exploitation of my client, Mrs. Margaret Davis, and the conspiracy to commit her to a long-term care facility under false pretenses." The color drained from Tyler's face. Nancy's smug expression dissolved into one of pure shock. They stared at me, then at the lawyer, as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Jessica continued, laying out her case piece by damning piece. She presented them with enlarged copies of my bank statements, with their lavish purchases highlighted in bright yellow. She slid a sworn affidavit from Monica across the table, detailing her repeated, thwarted attempts to contact me and the lies Nancy had told her about my frail condition. She then produced the brochure for Golden Meadows that she had subpoenaed from their computer records, complete with their email correspondence with the admissions advisor. "This," she said, tapping the brochure, "is what the court calls premeditation." Tyler started to stammer, to protest. "This is a misunderstanding." Mom was confused. "She wanted us to have the house. She did not want you to have the house under duress," Jessica countered, her voice like steel. "She wanted her family's love, and you exploited that love for financial gain." Nancy, recovering her composure, tried to bluster her way through. "This is absurd. She's our mother. We were trying to help her into an early grave." Jessica shot back. "Help her by stealing her life savings, and then plotting to have her declared incompetent. The court will find your definition of help to be quite interesting." She then delivered the final blow. "A lawsuit has been filed with the county court to have the deed transfer declared null and void due to undue influence and lack of capacity at the time of signing, given the emotional distress you had placed her under. We have also filed for an immediate injunction to prevent you from selling or borrowing against the property, and the district attorney's office has been sent our file regarding the financial exploitation charges. They are very interested in speaking with you both." The silence in the room was absolute. The trap had been sprung. The smug confidence on their faces had been replaced by raw primal panic. They looked at each other, their alliance of greed beginning to fracture under the weight of imminent consequence. They had thought they had won, that they had successfully discarded the old woman whose life they had plundered. They never imagined that the old woman would fight back. And in that moment, watching the terror dawn in my son-in-law's eyes, I felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness for the daughter I had lost. But beneath the sadness was a foundation of steel. I would get my home back. I would get my life back. The legal system, which Tyler and Nancy had viewed as a tool to be manipulated for their own gain, turned out to be a swift and righteous sword of justice. The mountain of evidence Jessica had compiled was irrefutable. The combination of financial records proving the systematic draining of my accounts, Monica's testimony about my forced isolation, the paper trail of their nursing home inquiry, and my own statement about the coercive circumstances of the deed transfer painted a picture so damning that their case crumbled before it even truly began. Their lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall, advised them to settle. The final judgment was a complete and total vindication. The court declared the deed transfer null and void, citing clear and convincing evidence of undue influence and financial exploitation. The house was mine again. They were ordered to repay every single penny they had stolen from my accounts, a sum meticulously calculated by Jessica's office, with interest. The district attorney, while not pressing criminal charges due to my request, a final foolish act of maternal mercy, put them on notice. Their names now flagged in the system for elder abuse. They were ruined. Their greed had consumed them, leaving them with nothing. They had to declare bankruptcy to deal with the mountain of debt they had accumulated on their own credit cards. The eviction from my house was swift and ignominious. They were given 48 hours to vacate. The day I stepped back through my own front door was one of the most emotional days of my life. Monica was with me, as was a locksmith to change every lock. The house felt alien, sterile, tainted by their presence and their cold gray paint, but it was my home. We opened every window, letting the fresh Cincinnati air sweep through the rooms, cleansing them of the past 2 years of misery. Slowly, painstakingly, I began the process of reclaiming my space and my life. The ugly, uncomfortable furniture was the first thing to go, donated to a charity. The garish abstract paintings were taken down and left by the curb. I went into the basement and retrieved Frank's old armchair, its familiar worn leather a comforting sight. I placed it back in its rightful spot by the fireplace. I went to the attic and brought down the boxes of my family photos. I spent an entire afternoon sitting on the floor, surrounded by my memories, carefully placing the pictures back on the mantelpiece and along the hallway walls. My history, which they had tried so hard to erase, was being restored. I filled my home with the sound of my favorite music again, gospel hymns and old soul records. I invited my friends over for a bridge game, filling the house with the sounds of laughter and chatter for the first time in what felt like an eternity. We drank coffee and ate my homemade meatloaf, and no one complained about the sodium content. I reflect on it all now, sitting here in Frank's armchair, a cup of tea in my hand, looking out at the backyard where I have already planted a new generation of rosebush. The scar on my heart from my daughter's betrayal will never fully fade. It is a painful reminder that blood is not always thicker than water, and that the deepest wounds are often inflicted by those we are supposed to love the most. But the pain is no longer the defining feature of my life. It has been joined by strength, by resilience, and by the profound peace of a quiet evening in a home that is truly, unequivocally my own. I have learned the hardest lesson of my life, but I have survived. I am not just a mother or a widow. I am Margaret, and I am finally home.